Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be here. This is also my introduction to UC Irvine in a certain kind of way. Nice to meet all of y'all in this class in global studies. Today, I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, but I try to simplify it for you in terms of an agenda. I'm going to give you some context on where I do research. I'll talk about one book that I'm working on. I'm talking about how that book speaks to what I think most of you read for a sample of my writing for today, a local issue with these transnational dimensions. And then I'll talk about another book I'm working on called Visions of Environmental Justice. So the sample that you wrote is actually from the book, it's called Visions of Global Environmental Justice, actually. It's from that book, and if I don't remember, please ask me later why I decided to change the title, because I think at the bottom of what you read, it says like myth-making in environmental justice or something like that. So if I don't explain it in the course of this presentation, I can explain why I changed the title later. Also, I should point out that what you read as a sample was just a draft. The book hasn't been published yet. And so I've changed it a lot since I've changed the version that you read has been transformed quite a bit. And if you care about that, I can explain how. The context of where I do research is the Pacific Southwest, or sometimes called the Pacific lowlands of Colombia. And why they're called lowlands is because they're west of the Andes Mountains. So Andes Mountains is this massive mountain range that goes all the way from Central America down through Chile. And it's caused by the same fault that runs through much of California, the San Andreas Fault. This area of the world is super tropical. It's considered very biodiverse. And I'll speak a lot more about what biodiversity means in different contexts later on in this presentation. It's one of the rainiest inhabited regions of the world. So I think the Big Island in Hawaii, I think the Big Island is also in there, and there's a place in India that also rains a lot and is inhabited. And outside of those places, it is one of the rainiest places where people actually live in the world. Every day I visit, especially along the coast, it's a guarantee that it's going to rain. In that area, there's a lot of national parks. There's also a lot of indigenous reservations similar to here in the United States. And there is also these things called comunidades negras. That is the exact terminology that they use in Colombia. It basically translates to black communities. And I'll explain more about them in a second. But for now, you should note that those comunidades negras are what you see kind of like in that pinkish, peachish color on the left side of the map, right? So essentially, most of the terrain between Panama and Ecuador is populated by these communities. And the way that these communities was established is through different organizations that have been in decades-long struggle to have them created, to have these territories where if you're an Afro-descendant person from these territories, you have a version of territorial sovereignty similar to indigenous reservations throughout the rest of the Americas. And I work with this organization called the Process of Black Communities. That's what that translates to. And as you can tell, there's a depiction of Africa there on the side with the acronym for the organization. And establishing that connection to Africa, that African heritage, and expressing themselves as Afro-descendants in a country that's been very hostile to Afro-descendant people is part of their mission. If I zoom in on this circle right here, you get a better sense of where exactly I was. And so this area of the country is very disconnected from roads. What you see in black and red is the road network within Colombia. And it's pretty much confined to the Andes highlands. So when the Spanish came and settled in Colombia, they mostly settled in the mountains because it's a more temperate climate, whereas the Amazon to the east and the south and the plains and the north and the far west was just like too tropical for a lot of Spanish and their descendants. And so there's only actually 2 roads that connect that entire strip between Panama and Ecuador to the rest of the country. And you can see that they're connected here in Tumaco and then up in Buenaventura, between Cali and Buenaventura. And everything else, the way people get around is by boat mostly, or they have little like little tuk-tuk like motorcycles in certain towns. But for the most part, it's disconnected from the rest of the country, both in terms of transportation, but also in terms of being able to sell anything, in terms of government, in so many different ways, right? And so the blue lines are the rivers, and that's a primary mode of transportation. Primary economic activities for people that live there are agriculture, aquaculture. So there's subsistence farming. There's also a lot of farming that you're gonna make money off of and sell certain crops. And the same thing with fishing and collecting shellfish, and et cetera. This area of the world is also subject to massive displacement due to activities such as gold mining, palm oil plantations, and coca cultivation, which is used in the production of cocaine, right? And to give you a sense of the scale of it, Colombia has the second largest population of internally displaced persons in the world, second only to Syria. Actually, it depends what year you look at this graph, but it's usually like top 3, right? And so this estimate has it at 5,700,000 in a country of roughly 50 million people. That means about 10% of the people that live in that country have been forced from their homes. And there's a high concentration of that displacement happening where I do research, in that southwestern corner of Colombia. And so we've already gone over some of those reasons. Gold mining, palm oil plantations, and coca cultivations are the primary reasons. And all of that, and the way that that has overlapped with decades of conflict within the country itself. So if I go back to this map, and you see how isolated it is from the rest of the country, you also get a sense of, or I hope you to give a sense of how disconnected it is from people that live in those Andean highlands and the main urban centers of the country. A lot of those folks have never felt like they're part of the country, which is why you have revolutionary armed groups like the FARC and the ELN have been engaged in decades of struggle because most farmers in Colombia, in a very dramatic difference to the United States, don't actually have a property title for the land. So it's very easy to kick them off their land when an armed group comes and threatens to take over the land, whether that armed group is a revolutionary armed group or whether it's rich landholders trying to get more land. It's very easy to kick those people off their land. So the first book I'm going to describe, I'm actually going to go backwards. Y'all didn't read anything from this book. It's a book I'm just barely started working on. And I call it an ethnographic novel, right? And it's called Environmental Justice and the War on Drugs in the Afro-Pacific. And Whereas the other book uses supernatural phenomena as a kind of narrative structure, in this book, it's my own experiences conducting field work, which provides the structure for the book. And so it's also kind of starts off with my first experience conducting field work. So I was interviewing a lot of the people that were forcibly displaced by decades of armed conflict, by cocoa cultivation, by palm oil plantations, by gold mining. And in this image, you can see I interviewed a lot of women to begin with that had been forcibly displaced from the countryside to the biggest city in that area of the country, Cali. I was asking them about their experiences of violence in the countryside and comparing it to their experience of violence in the city. And I wanted to know how these experiences translated to their beliefs in supernatural phenomena, which might seem kind of strange to you, but that's what I was interested in. At that point, I was a master's student in Latin American studies at UCLA, just kind of figuring out what I wanted to study for a PhD, and this is the project I came up with. So I sat down with about 40 different displaced, somewhere between 35 and 40 different displaced persons and people that work for the United Nations and other organizations that work with refugee populations, and interviewed them about those experiences. And people told me stories about the supernatural as what I had expected. For instance, this woman told me a story about what she called a destructive spirit that lived in her house. She said that she never saw the spirit, that when people come to visit her house, they felt something and they sensed a destructive spirit in the house. And she said that it got so bad that she eventually was paralyzed, and her friends arranged for a priest to come and conduct like a ritual to expel this spirit from her house. She said that after that happened, she started to feel a lot better. She was able to walk, and she was able to move out of the neighborhood. So all of this may sound very bizarre to you, and I don't blame you for thinking that. But my job as someone conducting this research was just kind of like make sense of what this person was talking about and interpret it. And the way I kind of thought about it is this spirit that she was talking about was just kind of a manifestation of all the things stressing her out in her life. The fact that there were still armed groups in the neighborhood that where she was displaced from had actually come to the city. The fact that people around her were getting killed because of that, right? The fact that she was broke, the fact that she lived in a polluted neighborhood, etc. So that's how I kind of describe it in that particular passage. But afterwards, I was left with this master's thesis that had won awards and that people were really excited about. That's supposed to be me. And I was wondering, like, what good did this research do? Did it actually help any of these people? Those are the kind of questions I faced with, so I really didn't publish anything about this experience until recently, until I was able to make better sense of it. And several years later, I was a student at Florida International University doing my PhD, and my advisor gave me this letter. And it's all written in Spanish, so if you could read Spanish, maybe you can make it out, but it's also pretty small, so I apologize. It says, "They fumigated, and a grandfather of this particular community council in this place in the Pacific died. He was in good health, and then this fumigation happened, and then the next day he died, and it's written as an open letter to the world to say, this is something that happened in our community that shouldn't be happening." And that piqued my interest, because I knew that the fumigation he was talking about was related to the U.S. war on drugs in Colombia, right? And I also, what drew my attention is that he called, or this letter calls this act biochemical warfare of the Colombian government against its own people. And at that point, I had a kind of an interest in the war on drugs, but I hadn't done a lot of research. But I knew some things. I knew that 90% of the cocaine consumed in the U.S. is processed in Colombia, and that for that reason, the U.S. puts a heavy emphasis on stopping the supply. I knew that cocaine is 50 times more expensive in the U.S. than it is in Colombia, and that just a small fraction of the profits remain in that country, while 97% of the profits are laundered in the first world. I also knew about Plan Colombia, which is one of the biggest foreign aid packages ever given out in U.S. history, starting in 2000. The fear was Colombia was on the verge of becoming what is known in IR talk as a failed state, right? Meaning the government's on the verge of collapse, which is a very, and in terms of U.S. geopolitics and U.S. international relations, anytime a country is kind of wobbling and they don't know who's going to be next, and they're worried that's going to be a kind of a socialist government or something they weren't expecting, that's a major cause for concern. So the U.S., between the year 2000 and the year 2016, has provided close to $10 billion in aid to Colombia. Now, the Colombian government originally wanted most of that money to be for improving the infrastructure of their actual government. But the U.S. is the one giving out the money, and so the U.S. government decided that has eventually made it so that 71% of that $10 billion has been spent on strengthening the Colombian military and police, including counter-narcotics. Because not only is Colombia on the verge of becoming a failed state, but the people that were threatening to take control were drug cartels. Also, the United States is in a position where, coming out of the Vietnam War, and this is true for a lot of different engagements, military engagements throughout the world, it doesn't want to look like it's intervening in someone else's country and sending all kinds of troops. So we'd rather send money and advisors and a limited number of staff to Colombia while still having a major influence on its politics and how it handles drugs. So they started this program, this is not the first time that aerial eradication was conducted in the country. It had been conducted in Mexico, had even been conducted on the big island of Hawaii when there was marijuana plantations in the 1990s. Been conducted, I believe, in Peru and I think Bolivia as well. Crop dusters, literally flying over places where coca is growing and spraying a chemical to make coca less potent and to make the cocaine produced by that coca less profitable. So the original focus was marijuana, and then it was coca, and they also do aerial fumigation of opium poppies. The idea is that it's safer than manual eradication. And for the people that are trying to do it, there's no disputing that fact. I talked to people who had been hired to, there's no more effective getting rid of a coca plant than ripping it out of the ground with your hands. Unfortunately, there's people shooting at you, there's explosive mines planted in the ground, there's all kinds of mosquito-borne diseases, and there's lots of things that can happen to you, other tropical diseases, right? So it is safer. The worst thing that's going to happen is that the plane's going to get shot out of the sky, which does happen as well. It's easier for the government, knowing how the road structure works, to get to those difficult to reach areas with these planes. And they argue that it's more cost effective. So it happens between the 1980s all the way to the day I finished field work in 2015. That was a total accident. And then there was a huge coca boom in Colombia for several years, and then it started up again between the years 2020 and 2022. And the herbicide, or the main chemical in the mixture is glyphosate, which you might know as Roundup. If you go to, I don't know if they still sell it. It was found to be probably carcinogenic, which means it is. And it's being banned all over the world, different states throughout the United States, different countries throughout the world, country by country. And if you're wondering, oh, well, what's the harm if the people use it on their lawns? It can't be that big of a deal if they're spraying it on these crops. Well, we don't know how much of a mixture they were using because no one will release that data. And they're spraying it on a lot more than just the crops. They're spraying it on people's subsistence crops, people's crops they're trying to sell. They end up spraying waterways. And we have all these kind of birth defects and other health issues associated with that. So I think one of the links that you were sent today is of this video where you saw the actual landscape, what it looked like after a week after it had been fumigated. You can see that there's some vegetation, but there's also a lot of dead growth or dead vegetation. And I also wanted to give you a sense of just how important food and agriculture is to the region. People live off producing or cultivating plantains and other crops, things that are not coca. I also wanted to give you a sense of the scale of the drug trade in this particular region of the world. So I'll explain this graphic in a second, but I want to point your attention to the fact that there's not as much traffic between Colombia and Miami, Florida, I should say. And that's because after decades of DEA and Coast Guard and other counter-drug initiatives, the flow between Colombia through the Caribbean was slowed down considerably, and the major flow of drugs is now through Central America and now up to Mexico, which is why a lot of people think Mexico has become the new Colombia in terms of drug cartels. And I put a circle again on the area where I do research. So what you see here is just an estimate of how big this volume is, right? The label on this is 2016 non-commercial maritime events, so mean like not registered by port authorities between Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico. So these are suspected maritime, meaning sea drug drop-offs, right? Which could take the form of submarines or submarines attached to boats or cargo boats or fishing boats. It takes a lot of different forms. People get more and more creative as time goes on. And it's particularly also noteworthy that for a region that doesn't have much access to the local markets of the rest of Colombia, they do have a lot of access to go north and at least sell something going north. So my second research experience was about interviews with people of Comunidades Negras impacted by that war on drugs strategy, aerial eradication. I didn't just do interviews. I also made maps like the one you see right here. So I can also conduct a geospatial analysis of areas impacted by aerial eradication. And I also interviewed the very people in charge of that war on drugs strategy, both Colombian. So this particular gentleman was in charge of detection. He was a Colombian police officer in charge of detection. I interviewed the ex-Colombian director of drug policy. I interviewed the section of the U.S. Embassy that's in charge of this program. I interviewed a lot of people, and I got a lot better access than I ever imagined. And so, for instance, there's an office of the U.S. Embassy, or the office of the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement operates within the U.S. Embassy in Colombia. And their response to aerial eradication was, there has never been a single case of serious health problems proven to be caused by glyphosate. We know that to be false now. A lot of studies have been conducted, but none offer conclusive evidence substantiated by the peer review process. Right? So that's what they told me in person when I asked them about this. And their way of masking the effects of this particular war on drugs strategy, I wouldn't say masking, their way of doubting the effects, or one of the reasons they doubted the effects was because they're like, well, you know, coca cultivation has its own chemical processes, and cocaine production has its own chemical processes. That's the real pollution. This is negligent. I also interviewed the affected communities who obviously had a very different perspective. They would say it ruined their crops, and then not only ruined their crops, but it ruined the seeds. That it forced insects to migrate from certain areas to other, and when those insects migrated, they exhibited different behavior and managed to ruin other crops. That it contaminated the water, that it caused cancer, that it caused skin diseases, and communities would show me pictures like this to the right of this child with these problems with his hands and his feet, that it led to birth defects, and it caused a number of respiratory ailments. And so eventually I came to see this as an environmental justice issue, which is why the first class I'm teaching here at UCI is global environmental justice, right? And I thought about how most environmental issues are framed in a vacuum. Save the otters, save the turtles, save the bees, save this, save that. And how environmental justice issues or environmental justice studies frames it a little bit differently, but it's still with limitations. Stop poisoning our community, right? X company, stop poisoning our community, right? But the limitation to that is, and as a lot of you probably know, when an environmental justice issue is solved in one part of the world, especially here in the United States, and if there's still a demand for that product, it doesn't mean that the company is going to change how they do things. They're just going to move that operation to another part of the world, right? And that's often what happens, right? When so many factories, I mean, Trump basically got elected because he promised he was going to bring all these factories and industries back to the United States that have moved out of the United States because of for wages and also environmental regulations, right? So critical environmental justice looks at environmental issues as structural problems. And so I borrow heavily from one of the leading authors in environmental justice studies, David Pello at UC Santa Barbara. So the second book, and the one that the sample that you read for today is from the book that I now call Visions of Environmental Justice. And this is a graphic from that book. And the EGS on the bottom of the globe stands for Environmental Justice Studies. And you see that there's people on the bottom that are part of a civil rights protest, and those standing on their shoulders on the top are the environmental justice activists. So environmental justice is a very specific terminology. When you see the words, you probably think it makes sense, but it has a very specific history out of the civil rights movement, out of the US South, that has now expanded to other places in the United States and other parts of the world. And that's what I'm drawing from when I'm framing this issue. And I use supernatural visions as a narrative structure. So now I'll talk about why I decided to change the name of the book. So, supernatural visions, if we're in the United States and you don't have an idea what I'm talking about, well, I'll talk about it in the chapter, but they're all over the Americas. They're not as prevalent in the United States, although there are things like, I guess, like Bigfoot could be considered a supernatural vision that people have seen that's kind of legendary and people doubt its existence. But in the book, I used some of these entities and frame them as eco-guardians, such as the troll, the forest troll that I talk about in the introductory chapter, who is a playful figure, but in a lot of Latin American countries has a kind of environmental, eco-guardian role, I would say. So I tell stories about how the troll, people I talked to said they saw the troll and he scared them off when they were fishing, and they're like, oh yeah, he was trying to protect the fish. There are other entities that protect people from, or discourage people from logging. There are entities that discourage people from letting their children run in the forest, and so forth. I also talk about supernatural visions as inscriptions of violence, of ghosts, of people, as ghosts as ways of thinking about the past and the way that it's inscribed into the present. The way that people, there are certain things that people don't want to talk about, that are painful, that still exist. That's another way I talk about it. And then I also made up some of my own supernatural entities to describe the war on drugs, and I use them to deconstruct the myths that I argue facilitate this form of environmental racism I talk about in the book. So that's why I decided to stop calling it myth making, because I decided I would reserve the word myth is usually associated with something that people don't believe in, or something that people are skeptical of, particularly like social scientists and scientists who are like, oh, that's peasant nonsense kind of thing. And I now use the word to only refer to the kind of geopolitical reasons the U.S. tries to justify this strategy of the war on drugs. So in what sense is the war on drugs, do I argue it as a form of transnational environmental racism? Well, there's myth number one is that cocaine is a security threat. And I put blank security threat, because the United States is usually framed as a national security threat, right? But in Colombia, the national security argument has fallen out of favor over several decades. So then now they talk about it's a public security threat. It's a citizen security threat. It's a human security threat. It's all versions of the exact same thing, but just kind of spun to say cocaine is a threat, and that's why we need to stop it. The alternative of this is to treat it as a public health issue, right? And many would argue that the best strategy is to do both, to treat it as a threat and a public health issue. But I'm of the mind that this strategy has failed, but it continues to be the strategy because it's not just drugs are a business, but also the war against drugs is a business. And people that are engaged in that war don't want to take themselves out of business. Whether that's the DEA, or if we want to look at mass incarceration, we can go on and on. And so I also think it's important to point out that when we think about where drugs come from and stopping this flow of drugs, that we not only criminalize the places that it come from, but also the people, right? When we talk about illegal immigrants and people that don't belong in this country, people coming from the global south, particularly people coming from Mexico, people coming from South America, this fear of, what do they call it? What was the Central American thing? I don't know, they use some kind of, these hordes of people coming from the global south, right, are also criminalized in political discourses as the source of, as if they're bringing in drugs, right? Transnational myth 2, I've already kind of talked about it a little bit. Coca cultivation is the ecological threat. It causes deforestation. This is an excerpt I took from the US Embassy website. What do the bad guys do? To plant coca, drug traffickers first go to a place and have to clear away forest or jungle using fire, using chemicals, axes, whatever they have. They're the first to destroy the environment, right? So we got to stop that. And the way that we're going to stop that is by spraying more chemicals. And the Colombian version has their own version of that. So this is a publication that they gave me when I visited called Deforestation, Pollution, and Poverty. It's all relating coca to deforestation, pollution, and poverty. So how do the communities that I work with, Comunidades Negras, resist this form of environmental racism through global networks? I'll give you 3 different examples. The first is that they challenge how government works. Because they express that as sovereign territories, you need to ask our permission to do stuff in our territory, right? And so this mural is a picture that I took outside one of the offices in that region. And it says, here we are a family, we exist, and we resist for the territory. So this idea that territory is everything, territory is life. And I'll show you another example of how, a more detailed example of how that works. So for instance, this is one of the things I did as part of my research was I joined a court case in which 27,000 Colombians were suing the Colombian police for damages caused by aerial eradication. And so I got an actual flight log from the pilots that were conducting the missions. And the most important signature, the ombudsman, the person who's in charge of misadministration in that particular locality, did not sign this document. So the most important person, the pilots all signed it, that's awesome, but the person that's supposed to approve this mission did not sign it. Those are the things I kind of noticed, right? And that's me, gringo researcher. This document is missing signatures. Another way that, that these communities challenge environmental racism and assert environmental justice, I would argue, is to reject and reframe criminality. So I think you also saw this clip as an attachment to the presentation today. The gentleman says, it is a banned chemical, but they, the Colombian government, have to exhaust it to satisfy the US. Because the US finances it, so they dump it on us in the Pacific coast. They dump it on us blacks, on our houses, right? Making it very clear that, that this would not be the strategy in other parts of Colombia, let alone in the United States, right? And what situation would people actually permit this kind of spraying over people's homes and in their communities, right? It is because the people that are most affected by this are making decisions from far away, from Washington, D.C., and from the capital of Colombia in Bogota. So one of the things that these, and this is another illustration from my book, one of the things that these communities have done is argued that their territory is a victim of the armed conflict and drug trafficking. And they rely on international human rights laws to achieve these kind of, what's called jurisprudence, which is court rulings that eventually become the basis for a law, right? Law that's created through court rulings. And then the last thing, and then I'm going to wrap this presentation up, is they articulate alternative versions of environmental conservation and rights. And I think this is very important for anybody that, that thinks about environmental conservation or does work in biology and the natural sciences. The biodiversity of species we have here forms part of the collective of life. Essentially, we are that, everything existing together. We defend biodiversity not because a species is becoming extinct, but we do so because it affects the habitat, the entire ecosystem. If you're not understanding what's being said here is, the conventional understanding of biodiversity is something that doesn't involve human beings. It's genetic material usually, that we need to save this forest because it might have the cure for some kind of medicine, or it might have some natural resource that we need. And so often, people that are already living in those areas are excluded from the definition of biodiversity. The people that already live and maintain these areas are basically invisibilized and not imagined as part of those spaces. And that's why it says we are that. We are everything existing together. And so another movement right now is natural entities with rights. So for instance, a river with rights, which may sound bizarre to you, but there are different places throughout the world assigning rights to natural entities. And this is an illustration I had commissioned for this to show you. Obviously, it has the form of a human. Here in the United States, one of the Great Lakes is considered a lake with rights. There's a river in China. I believe the first river was in New Zealand. And now there's one river in Colombia, and we're on the verge of having another river in Colombia as being rivers with rights. And this is also something done through engagement with international organizations, such as International Rivers, which is located in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the Earth Law Center, which I believe is based out of Seattle. So at the beginning of that reading, I posed a question: how do these stories connect? I'm not sure that you'll be able to connect them based on this presentation, but if you read the whole book, which hopefully comes out next year, this is what I hope you take away from it. Violence and environmentalism are inextricable from one another. They're two sides of the same coin in many cases, right? With the same kind of structural root problems. Humans are not the only beings displaced by violence and pollution. Whether you believe in supernatural stuff or whether you believe that rivers have spirits or not, there's other things that we should think of as part of our ecological communities. Insects, plants. And so the hope is that people start to change how we think about what is community. And environmental justice has global and more than human dimensions. So I have no idea how long I've been talking for, but that's my presentation. Thank you.